Dun, 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 dun. I don't know if that's our official theme music. We need to work on something. But we're back for part two. If you watched the first 15 minutes and decided that you had enough time in your life during quarantine to watch the second part of this, we say God bless you for sticking with us. If you didn't watch the first part and you're coming to the second part, even though this isn't scripted, I'm going to say you're probably okay. I mean, you're probably going to be all right. Do you have to watch the first part? I don't know. I don't know if it was coherent enough to say it followed certain steps. But we welcome you back. Just a quick recap introduction, since we don't have cool graphics yet for this. But Pastor Jeff Stieber from Ohio, as we stated in the first one, from the entire state. Pastor Andrew Gukin, who's from space, from Rochester, New York. We both went to Trinity Lutheran Seminary together, started off our careers there. And if you hold on, either it's at the end of this part or potentially, I don't know if it's going to be a third part, I have a fun little story to share. So on meeting Pastor Andrew. All right, so the discussion is around communion. It's about communion during this time of quarantine. People have been abstaining from it in both of our congregations, at least as far as we know. I mean, I guess they could be having private communion services in their homes without us knowing, of abstaining, not participating in virtual communion. And where the conversation has led us to at this point is saying, with coming at it from the premise of God can do anything. It's doing virtual communion is not a question about can God work through those means. It's a question of, does virtual communion, does it represent who we are as a people in the body of Christ from the Lutheran tradition? And I'm going to be honest, I'm going to throw this out there too, even though I don't think it would be the first thing we talk about. If I'm being honest, I think all of my answers are going to be contextual answers. They're going to be subjective in the sense that March was the last time I had communion. So it's been 2.5 months. So this is my opinion now. If something happened in quarantine lasted another 6 months, my answer might change. I might say at 2.5 months, I was cool with no virtual communion. At 7 or 8 months, all right, now we have to start getting creative, you know. So for right now, the question that we're going to be addressing is, and I'll lob something over to Pastor Andrew, question is not can God do it, but is this something that makes sense with our Lutheran identity as people? And so what I'll put back to you, Andrew, is this. So you and I both completely believe that it's not a question of, if I say the words of institution in the night in which your Lord, if I want it for the words of institution that I just stumbled over right now, it's been 2.5 months. If I went through that, does the Holy Spirit have the ability to then consecrate whatever elements in your house that you'd be able to take it and I'd be able to take it? We would be taking it together even though we're in two different spaces. Yes, we are. However, do you think that, and does the timeline matter? Does that factor in for you? Do you think that that is something that if we didn't have these extraordinary circumstances right now, would we ever go for virtual communion at a time when we weren't under a pandemic? Is it something we could just make a rule for and say, yeah, we could totally do this theologically, so that's what we should do?
There's a lot in what you just said in the last, I don't know, was that 20 minutes?
45 minutes.
There's a lot that you said in there. So here we are 2.5 months into not having communion, but maybe I want to address this. So you said, so in 6 months, if we haven't had it, so then we're at 8.5 months, then our view might change. That's very interesting because, again, that's a reminder that, because the big thing that's talked about with this is, well, we're Lutherans, and so that Lutheran identity. So what did Luther say about that? Luther, I think, wrote the most about the sacrament of communion than anything else. And the reason for that is that was like a big part of his, I want to say, his baptismal journey, which is life, is just that constant coming back to it. And, you know, is this still what I believe? Is this still what I feel is not right, but is this still, you know, how I understand this? His whole life. And it changed. And it changed. So how Lutheran of you to say that if in 6 months you're like, oh yeah, well, maybe we can do this, or yeah. But, you know, that brings up something else, because when we look at the two sacraments, the first one, well, whatever. The first one being baptism, only because, you know, infant baptism. So I say that's first. There is in the Lutheran understanding, which interestingly enough, the church that kind of has let it go to the wayside is what would be the American church. See, where was I going? So with baptism, there is that emergent, like in a sense, emergence clause. You know what I mean? So it's, you know, because I don't want to be. So you're in a car wreck and you're hanging outside. You know,
no, I probably would be. Yeah.
You know, and
disclaimer, you're going to say something, disclaimer. If I get in a car wreck today or the next 48 hours, you're going to feel horrible about the fact that you just said that. But beyond, but go ahead. I want you to, that's okay. You've already cast the die. I'm in a car wreck. What would you do for me? All right, go ahead.
Wow. Well, that's a downer.
You set the pins up. I just knock them down. Yeah.
So here's the thing. So there's this emergence clause in a sense, and clause isn't the right word, but for baptism. So you're in a car wreck. You know, whomever shows up from the ambulance and they see you and they're like, all right, this guy's going to die. That Lutheran belief, you know, coming from the priesthood of all believers, is if you looked at this EMT and you're like, baptize me because I'm going to die.
Yeah, and they were of the same, they agreed with it, obviously, but yeah.
Yeah, and you haven't been baptized before, of course.
Right.
So you're like, baptize me. And so they get water out of this puddle and they do it, you know, because that's the belief, because it came, Luther's understanding, and of course this is progressed and evolved. His understanding was, yeah, you know, baptism is needed. It is directly connected to our salvation. So that's evolved. So, but so what I want to say is with communion, there isn't this emergence clause. Right. Yeah. So it's like, oh, well, oh, you've never had communion. Okay. That really doesn't affect your salvation at all.
Right. So, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So, you know, so you have this length of time, and it's not like we need communion and it's been 9 months and it's like, well, we need this and we need to have it. Although
it's not a salvation. It's not an issue of salvation.
Yeah. Although it's interesting because I think a majority of Lutheran churches, especially, and I know Roman Catholic churches, they base their membership on you had to commune in the last year. Which,
at least once. Yeah.
Yeah, at least once. So if we get to February next year and people haven't had communion, then we're going to kind of run into this thing.
Yeah.
But then again, it'll probably just be like, well, it was a pandemic, so God understands, and God will, and God does.
Yeah.
So I kind of went off there, but yeah. So you have those things, but it's the question of virtual communion. And the other thing that I want to say, and I know we're probably almost to 15 minutes now, but
we got 4.5 left. Yeah.
4.5 left. So interesting. I was watching this video of the bishop. I think I mentioned it in the last video. And what he talked about is this argument actually is nothing new, because technology has progressed, but there's always, you know, there's been technology. So it's, how would you feel if all we had was a radio and we're listening to the radio broadcast, and so then the minister gets to He's like, all right, now we're going to have radio communion. Take whatever you have, put it on top of the radio, and it'll be consecrated. Do we feel the same about that? And then also, so then we progress to television. There's a televised service. So it's like, okay, we're going to have communion now. Put what you have, if you're watching this, on top of the TV, which would be hard now with flat screens. But, you know, so is it consecrated? And then that gets into another thing. What if you're watching, like what's happening here? A lot of churches are putting up services from last year on TV. So it's like, oh, well, let me go through, you know, what if they're on demand? Because there's some on demand church services, which that kind of boggles my mind. But, well, let me pick one where there's communion. Can we do that? Is it still consecrated? If it was recorded, well, even, you know?
Yeah, because I mean, even with your situation, with mine as well, but with yours taking place in the church, when you guys record your services, that you're recording that on, let's say, I don't know when, but let's say it's a Saturday morning or a Thursday night.
Yeah.
And you're posting it on Sunday or Saturday or Sunday, but you've recorded it 2 days earlier. So is it a question of like, well, the radio would be better then because you were listening in live in real time, but you saying the words institution on a Thursday and then applying them on a Sunday? Or is it because that's when you're seeing it, so is it live? And once again, all these ideas of like God can do whatever, but it actually works into the idea, which probably plays into the virtual sense of whether it's right or wrong, of our understanding to say, if I know I'm going to be gone on a certain weekend, and we have not gotten a supply pastor, an ordained pastor to come in and serve, one of our lay members are going to lead it. And I say, all right, well, it's Wednesday. I'm going on vacation for the next week, but I'm going to run up to the church real quick, grab the wafers, grab the bread, the wine. I'm going to go through the words of institution. I'm going to consecrate it. And then we'll leave it in the sacristy. And then when they come in on Sunday, they can use it because it's been consecrated. And I know, at least in my experience in talking to Bishop Eaton when she was in Northeast Ohio and her bishop, currently Bishop Abraham Allende, about that topic, the thought is, yeah, that's not really the way we're supposed to do it. That it is something that happens in the midst of the community. It's part of the same reason we do not do like our Catholic brethren, where we don't do private baptisms unless it's an emergency. That we don't say, like the one Catholic baptism I attended, just kind of blew my mind because I'd never seen it before, but they did the entire liturgy, the entire service. And they said, all right, we have 5 baptisms today, but they happen completely after the worship service and like in a side chapel. And for us, we would be like, yeah, we don't do that. So whether it's baptism being with the other sacrament and with communion, does that, like, would you do a virtual baptism? Would you have a bowl of water and say, I'm going to go through the liturgy and you're going to take water at home and you're going to do the baptism? And like, at that point, are we just checking off boxes to say like, well, we did this and we did this and we did this because God can do it? Or would we say, all right, this person that's getting baptized today. So we had one at our church I serve. We had one baptism scheduled for the end of April that we didn't get to do. And would it, it was an emergency situation. So is that something where I'd say like, okay, I'm going to FaceTime you and I'm going to say the words and you're going to put the water and oil on little Marilyn? Or is it something where you say, no, we'll wait till we get back to do that? It's not that we couldn't do it the other way, but it's just not what we do. And so I wonder if it does need to be tied, if we're talking theologically and what it means to be a community, can we separate the two sacraments? Or do we have to say, if this is what we would do for one, then it really applies to the other one as well? Because I really do appreciate what you said, because it points out my original position when we started the second part of the video was when I said if it were 6 months later, I realized that would be coming from a point of selfishness. It would not be, and I don't even necessarily mean that in a negative way, but it would be a selfish thing. It's not because I would feel like, all right, I have to have this or I'm going to go to hell, which is a whole nother discussion. But it'd be something like, all right, how long could I go before I really, really miss it? And then I make an exception and be like, I'm just doing this, but it wouldn't have good theological reasoning behind it. It would just be like, I'm deciding to do this. So I think it's almost 1 o'clock, and which doesn't matter for anybody who's watching this, but it's about 15 minutes. If we pause it and we do only one more, because we could do 7 of these, 17, take that, numbers. But we could do 7 of these that, if we stop this video and then go to a final part, I guess that's what I'm going to want to start off with is, what is the reason we celebrate these?
Yes.
What is the reason that God provides these?
Yes.
And if we've been baptized and we're assured of our salvation and we receive communion, which is that returning to that foundation of our baptismal life, is that, why do they exist? And therefore, how does that play into how we celebrate that? So I think that's a decent segue, cliffhanger. I don't know if you want to add anything to that before we...
I'll just add this, that will be a further cliffhanger.
Ooh, yeah.
I think we cannot equate both sacraments together. If you want to hear more,
we're going to fist fight over this.
If you want to hear more, tune in to part 3.
Part thrice.